Hello, everybody. The numbers are in when it comes to economic inequality in the United States, and those numbers don't reflect well on the country. There was a Pew Research piece a couple of years ago suggesting that, at least in 2021, Asian households had a median net worth of $320,000 compared to $250,000 for whites, 48,000 for Hispanics, and 27,000 for Black people in America. That has increased a little bit over the last couple of years, but as a Brookings report suggests, while Black wealth might be increasing, so is the racial wealth gap. According to NBC, that gap now is $1 million dividing white families from Black and Hispanic ones. There's a new book on this, co-written by Louise Story and Ebony Reed, two very distinguished American journalists. 15 cents on the dollar, how Americans made the Black-white wealth gap. Ebony Reed, one of the authors, is joining us from Kansas City, appropriately enough, right in the middle of the country. The book is already a bestseller on USA Today, so the book is doing very well. It's been out for a few weeks. Ebony, why did you choose to focus on the Black-white wealth gap? You might have included Hispanics, you might have even included Asian Americans who are clearly wealthier, at least according to that Pew poll, than whites.
Sure. So first, thank you for having me. And Louise and I, my co-author, are a pair of Black and white journalists. So when we looked at this, issue, we looked at Black Americans because of the gap being so severe facing Black Americans, but also, we brought our lived experiences to this project, being able to interview people and navigate certain communities. So certainly there's work out there to do on other wealth gaps, but Black Americans were enslaved in this country, and we felt it was really important to look at this particular group for those reasons.
Yeah, Louise was supposed to be joining us too, but she had some arrangement
Mhm.
problems, I think scheduling problems with her kids. Do you think the fact that she's white, you're Black, did that contribute in some way to the narrative and perhaps even the project itself?
Well, I think that it helped us. We brought our experiences as individuals, also as journalists, and so our number one goal with this project is helping people learn about the statistic. We're trying to make 15 cents on the dollar a nationally recognized statistic. There are surveys that show that more than 40% of white Americans think that the Black-white wealth gap has gone away, and a similar percentage of Black Americans think the gap is much smaller than what it is. So we're trying to help people understand that a typical Black family has 15 cents in wealth for every $1 a typical white family has in America. And that is true in the mean, which is the entire distribution, and also, the median, which is the entire distribution, and also the mean, which is the average. And this is from the Federal Reserve.
Well, so this is a concrete, indisputable number, is it? Would all economists pretty much agree that on this 15 cents on the dollar argument that why the blacks only have blacks own 15% of every dollar that an average white would own. It's not earn, it's own. Is that correct?
Right. So part of I think helping communities understand this, Louise and I have been traveling and doing public racial wealth gap symposiums in communities across the country since February, and we find that often people don't understand what wealth is, and so that's also part of the education process of the trying to share this information. Wealth is everything that you own minus everything that you owe. Wealth is different from income. And so often when people start talking about this issue, they'll notice that people will start talking about income, and they might say, well, I don't understand this wealth gap because I sit next to someone at work who's a Black American and they earn the same amount as I do. Well, that might be true in some, higher paying jobs. And there is some data out there that suggests that those who earn higher, that the income gap is converged at the upper end of the spectrum. But that is just an input in wealth. Income is what you earn, but it isn't necessarily the same as your wealth, because people can, live in a big home and that thing can have a lot of mortgage on, have a huge mortgage on it, a lot of debt. And so we're just trying to help educate people about this, because Louise and I do feel if more people understood the data, and this comes from the Federal Reserve, our government here in the United States, then it will impact conversations that people will have about affordable housing, student loans, entrepreneurship, a variety of topics.
The book inevitably historicizes the black-white relationship, if that's the right word to describe it. You talked earlier about slavery, of course, being the foundation, the terrible foundation of that relationship. What you're doing then when you're writing and researching wealth is you're historicizing this. You're making wealth ancestral, aren't you? Because it's often or always passed down, if it exists, from parents to children. So is there a timeless quality, in a sense, to this research and your analysis?
Well, I think so. I hope so. I will tell you that this project for us began in the summer of 2020. Like many Americans, Louise and I were having conversations about inequities, things we had seen in our communities, workplaces. And it was that first pandemic summer, we couldn't go anywhere. And we started reading books, having conversations. We were colleagues at the Wall Street Journal, and we realized that there was no book that existed that was the complete history of the Black white wealth gap all the way to present day, that had current contemporary people who were still living quoted in the book. So I do think that our book has a timeless, quality to it, as much as, that can be the case. But there also is a very significant historical aspect of our book that took a lot of research and nearly 400 interviews to be able to create.
And is your story different from, you mentioned COVID and what happened during that? Of course, when historians remember the COVID period, the George Floyd murder will appear, I think, prominent there. Is your book a reflection of those kinds of injustices, of police violence, particularly white police violence on Black men, or is that a separate subject?
I think people will find that coming up through the lives of the people that we chronicled and what they experienced. So, our book is a deep dive on 7 Black families. There is also an entrepreneurship effort that we're following in the book that is named Greenwood Bank, that is a fintech, so it's a banking effort that was launched in the summer of 2020, and it had the stated mission to try to close the Black white wealth gap. Some of the founders of this bank, our banking effort, we found them to be very interesting as individuals.
Yeah, I know that. Well, there are 3 of them. Andrew Young, of course, Andrew Young being a very famous civil rights activist,
Mhm.
associate of Martin Luther King. Michael Render, a well-known rapper, and then Andrew Glover, a Hollywood or an entertainment mogul.
Mhm. And then the other 4 people in the book, most people may not know who they are before they read, but they include people that either were customers of the Greenwood banking effort, or they fit the profile of the types of people that Greenwood hoped to market their products to. And so, in that, excuse me, in that batch of people, then we have a man who lives in New Hampshire, who is a Black American. He's married to a white woman. He was raised, in Eastern Georgia. And in the summer, of 2020, his father is killed by the police the summer before. We also have a woman in the book who's from North Carolina, and she's trying to raise up her family economically with the lens on her mom. And she tries to go to Atlanta to live there and finds it expensive to stay. We also have the youngest head of the Georgia NAACP, and he's trying to, you know, fight for social justice and economic justice for Black Americans, but he doesn't come from much wealth, and a lot of his work is unpaid. We have an entrepreneur in the book, Mr. Lovelace, who has a barbecue business, and he is a victim of a rent to own contract, and he is fighting to hold on to his home.
So let's go back, Ebony, to this Greenwood company. Of course, it's a reference to the terrible incidents in Tulsa
Mhm.
at the beginning of the century. Perhaps you might mention what happened in Tulsa and why it's relevant to the arguments you're making in 15 cents on the dollar. And then explain, because I have to admit, before coming across your book, I'd never heard of the Greenwood Company.
Mm. Well, the Greenwood, you know, was a business district in Tulsa. It still, you know, exists, but it was a district that, you know, it had been burned down. You know, there were accusations involving assault and a woman, and members of the white community came into this Black community that was a thriving business district.
What was
And
it? Was it? I always remember the phrase. It was the Wall Street of African
it,
American
it
community
was.
after slavery, of course.
It was, and burned and torched and killed people who lived
What
there.
year was that, Ebony? Do you remember?
You're gonna ask me that. I'm gonna have to look in my book because
No.
I got all the dates in the book, but the point I want to make about that is that it had an impact on that community that would last, you know, generations. I was there a couple weeks ago in Tulsa and visited a bookstore there and visited the Black Wall Street, you know, area. But yes, the banking effort is named after what happened there in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I also want to note too that, you know, while that incident is famous and, you know, well known, similar incidents happened across the United States. So we also have that, you know, mentioned and chronicled in the book because these incidences of violence had an impact on Black wealth.
Yeah, we've done some shows on that. Old friend of the show, an old friend of mine is Carol Anderson. I'm sure you know her work, a very distinguished African American historian at Emory University. She grew up near the site of one of these riots. I've always understood Greenwood isn't unusual in the sense that it was white violence on Black Americans. But how much of this, in your view, Ebony, was rooted in the fact that these were middle class African Americans and that the whites rejected the idea of Black ownership of property and of capital?
Well, they were thriving Black communities, and they were making money, and then all of a sudden, you know, they were not. So the areas that were, you know, were poor were not the ones that were targeted. I do want to go back to your question that you asked me a second ago, and I couldn't think of the year. It was 1921 was the year of the
After the First World War, of course, many African Americans came back to a deeply racist system, having fought for the United States. Um, how would you fit the narrative of Greenwood, Ebony, into the failure of Reconstruction in America?
Oh, interesting.
How attached, entangled is this with the politics, particularly the politics of the South, post Civil War politics?
So after the Civil War, you know, Louise and I have a chart that we show in our community symposiums that shows the trajectory of the Black white wealth gap over time. And so after the Civil War, you know, the typical Black family had 1.8 cents for every dollar a typical white family had. And that number, you know, we see it drop for white families. We see their wealth drop because Black Americans were no longer counted in their wealth, and Black Americans as enslaved people had been
So this
included.
was so this chart would have been pre-Civil War.
The chart starts around 1860, so a little bit before the chart that we have. But the point I want to make is that, over time, while there were some gains for Black Americans after Reconstruction, some were able to buy land, not all able to hold on to the land. And we do chronicle the attacks on Black land ownership and wealth in our book. There hasn't been that much progress when we look at the entire length of time, from 1865 to now. 15 cents is an improvement of 1.8 cents, but the black white wealth gap today sits at where it was in the 1950s.
Yeah, which I think will disappoint many of our viewers and listeners. Um, is there an alternative narrative? Ebony, had Reconstruction not failed,
Hmm.
had African Americans been accepted like every other group,
Mhm.
theoretically,
Mhm.
Jews,
Mhm.
Irish, Americans,
Mhm.
even Hispanics, into mainstream America, is it conceivable, had Reconstruction not failed and you had the appearance of Jim Crow America, that we wouldn't
There's
have
certain
had a 15 cents on the dollar book, and that there wouldn't be much of a difference between black and white Americans when it came to their wealth?
Well, we took special care in the subtitle of our book. And the reason that it says how Americans made the black white wealth gap is because there were deliberate decisions and choices that people made. And so yes, decisions were made after slavery. There was the 40 acres and a mule promise that people didn't receive. There were things implemented that were not carried out in an equitable way. So, like, we could look at what happened with the GI Bill, which was, set up for those who had served our country after World War II. And it was to benefit all veterans, not just those who were white, for of all races. And Black Americans overwhelmingly were not able to use the GI Bill to purchase a home. And the GI Bill was, set up to help people buy homes, start businesses, and also go to school. And so there is a researcher at Middle Tennessee State University who I interviewed a few months ago for a piece for the LA Times, and he has crunched data and said if Black Americans had been able to equitably access the GI Bill, we would have today somewhere north of 400,000 more Black homeowners in our country. Because as you mentioned earlier, wealth is generational. People pass it down to their children throughout their lives and also when they pass away.
There'll be some people, and I'm sure you've heard this critique many
Mhm.
times before, Ebony, who will be watching and listening and saying, of course, she's right. When it came to the failure of Reconstruction, it goes without saying, in slavery. But today, post civil rights 60s, there are many opportunities for African Americans, and that's proved by the careers of people like Andrew Young, Michael Render, the other, and is it Andrew Glover?
Yes,
In
Ryan Glover. Ryan Glover.
So Ryan Glover,
Mhm.
and that all you need to do in America to real, and this is perhaps more of a familiar Republican Party argument than a Democratic one, but all you need to do is work hard, pursue your dream in music or in entertainment or in politics, and that you can realize yourself. How would you react to those arguments?
Well, first, let me say this. Wealth is something that people pass along to their children, not just when they pass away, but throughout their lives. So, Black Americans are more likely to have student loan debt when they go to college and graduate. They are less likely to have someone in their family that has the access and ability to give them a down payment for their first home. So, while there's been a lot of advancements in society, for Black Americans over the last 50 plus years, as you mentioned, access to jobs and education, even, with the housing, there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to the amount of debt that people would amass and who would pay for things. So, yes, college is an opportunity for all who can get in, but it also amounts to a large amount of debt for Black families. And I will tell you, in the reporting of this book, um, the worst position that people could find themselves in, particularly Black Americans, is that they've gone to college, amassed debt, for whatever reason, not finished their degree, and it's not always their fault, and then they can't get a higher paying job to pay off the debt. So, in the case of Brooke Bacon, the man that I mentioned earlier from New Hampshire, when he was younger and he was going to college, his mom was also going to school too to better herself and improve herself. And he had enough money, resources were set up for him to, he had made it through his first semester. And then he gets a call from the financial aid office and he's told he needs a cosigner. And he didn't know that he would need a cosigner to continue in school. His mother couldn't co-sign because she was technically a student. He checked in with his family and no one had the assets or the wealth to co-sign for him. So he was making good grades. He had to leave college. He had to go get a job and figure out when he could eventually come back and how he would finance that.
We are speaking with Ebony Reed, co-author of 15 Cents on the Dollar, How Americans Made the Black-White Wealth Gap. I want to remind you that great guests like Ebony Reed are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, excellent new quarterly of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Ebony to talk more about the Black-White wealth gap and what we can do about it. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas, it's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Ebony Reed, the co-author of 15 Cents on the Dollar, How Americans Made the Black-White Wealth Gap. Ebony, tell me more about this Greenwood firm that was founded by Young, Render, and Glover. What were they trying to do, and why is their story so emblematic of this wealth gap?
Well, Greenwood is a fintech, and so it was setting up a banking service and trying to attack the black-white wealth gap. In our book, what people will find is that that is a very complicated um, issue to tackle because there's so many intersections and so many complexities with trying to solve the black white wealth gap. I don't want to give it all away for people who are still reading, but people will find that it isn't an easy thing to try to attack from a business perspective.
What were they trying to do, though? How were they trying to do it? Was it just a fintech designed to lend African Americans money for real estate?
It was set up as a fintech for people to have savings and checkings accounts. Some of their customers raised questions about when or if they would be able to have loans. So it offered some of the same services that you might see at a traditional bank, but with the fintech, you have to have a banking partner because you're not, technically a bank. And so that's what they were trying to do, and also shine a light on Black businesses and target the underbanked and banked underbanked and unbanked Black community was a part of their early stated goals.
So would it be fair to call Greenwood a failure?
I think it's a little early to say that it's a failure. I mean, the black
It
white wealth,
certainly struggled, though. It's no roaring success.
that's true. It has faced some difficulties.
And would it be fair to say that that's a reflection of the structural problems, or is it a reflection of a rather unholy alliance of founders? I mean, Young, Render, and Glover, they might have the same color skins, but I'm guessing they didn't have that much else in common.
Well, we spent a lot of time with each of them, talking with them about their families, their concerns about the black white wealth gap, issues that the Black community faces. Trying to solve the black white wealth gap is not an easy thing. And it's still early days for any type of entrepreneurship effort that started just a few years ago. So I think only time will tell, how that story will be, completely written.
But why did it struggle? I think many people will be watching and listening and disappointed that Greenwood didn't take off or hasn't taken off massively yet. Why not? It makes complete sense. What were the problems?
Well, there were, several issues that the banking effort faced. I mean, trying to get people to change who they currently bank with is one of the issues. One of their investors that we interview talk with us about a lot of times, people are set with, their banking relationship or their current practice, however they're practicing banking. And so whenever you introduce something new, you're asking people to change. And so, that would be one of the challenges that they would face. They also would face a customer base that was super excited and, was clamoring for, loans and different products. And, it took them a while to roll out some of the initiatives that they had. So, there were multiple things happening, over time that they faced as an entrepreneurial effort.
And what about the role of conventional banks, a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo? Couldn't they launch Greenwood-style initiatives within their own banks?
Well, actually, some of the largest banks in the United States invested in this effort. And we interviewed some people, from there, and they talk with us about how, trying to reach the unbanked and underbanked population of Black Americans is not easy for many banks. And part of that, when we think about things historically in our country, goes back to the Freedmen's Bank and attitudes and experiences that Black Americans have had across time, with banking. So the Freedmen's Bank was a bank that was set up to service Black Americans after the Civil War. Many of them had fought in the Civil War. They were veterans. They had money, saved from that time. And they were encouraged to invest their money, to save their money in Freedmen's Bank. And so they put their money in, and then the bank went through a series of mismanagement, fraud. People lost their money. Not all Black Americans were paid back. And so, though that experience was devastating for a community of people that had been formerly enslaved. And so those stories passed down, coupled with other experiences that Black Americans had from not being able to, utilize the GI Bill. Some of the families that we interviewed for our book told us they had relatives that went to banks and were told, no, we won't approve you for a mortgage, or we want to prove your ability to use the GI Bill because the homes and the communities where you want to live have restrictive covenants, which were written into the deeds and meant that people couldn't buy homes. And then we get to the 2008 housing crisis, which we also cover, the economic crisis in our country. I sometimes refer to it as a housing crisis because it impacted housing for so many Americans. And we see through that crisis that Black Americans, regardless of their level of income, even high earning Black Americans, were put into subprime mortgages. So when we talk about
Racially, I mean, you're suggesting that mortgage brokers, knowing the color of people's skin, would put them into a subprime deal?
I can just speak to the facts, and the facts are that Black Americans, and we chronicle this in our book and we cite the data on it, were in subprime mortgages more often than white Americans, even at the same income level. And so what I'm saying is that over time, Black Americans have had all of these experiences with banks. They've heard about what has happened to their parents, their grandparents, their other, relatives. And so it isn't an easy effort to get people who've had these experiences to trust in banking. And I think that that is one of the things, while there were many things, that Greenwood was up against.
Ebony, the subtitle of your book, 15 Cents on the Dollar, is How Americans Made the Black-White Wealth Gap. It's not how some Americans or how wealthy Americans. Are you suggesting that all Americans, perhaps particularly white Americans, have a responsibility, whether they know it or not, to this wealth gap?
That's an interesting question. We posed that question to one of Andrew Young's relatives when we were interviewing for this book. And that person said to me, I think that white Americans bear more responsibility because they were in more of a position of power when this wealth gap was created. The bottom line is that the Black white wealth gap impacts all of us. It impacts Black Americans, obviously, but it also impacts, broader, society. And if you are a person who cares about other people, who cares about equity, who cares about the ability for business growth and fairness, then you're also a person that will be interested in this book and understanding more about the history, with our country.
I know you chose because of you're an African American woman, Louise Story as a white woman. You chose to make this about the Black white wealth gap. But what happens if you throw in? We began this show referencing both Hispanic wealth or lack of wealth, perhaps, and Asian American wealth. Asian Americans, on average, are much wealthier than white Americans. What would happen if you threw those two communities in as well? Would that muddy the story, or actually underline what you're arguing in 15 cents on the dollar?
Well, I can tell you that our research is nowhere near as in depth for those two communities because we focused extensively on Black Americans and white Americans. But in terms of the wealth gap, the Latino white wealth gap, I can tell you is 22 cents on the dollar. So a
So not
typical,
much difference.
well,
7 cents more.
Well, and they may actually be even closer to Black Americans. So a typical Latino family would have 22 cents in wealth for every $1 a typical white family has. Now, that Federal Reserve data does not take into account undocumented workers. So there are some experts who think that their number is actually closer to the Black white wealth gap.
I don't think anyone would disagree with your basic premise, or certainly the statistical foundations of your argument on 15 cents on the dollar. The question, of course, Ebony, is what to do. It seems to me that implicit in this argument is a suggestion that there is a need for a serious conversation about reparations because the profound inequalities between whites and blacks go back to slavery. Is that fair? How do you, and I know you can't speak on behalf of Louise, but is there an argument implicitly in this book, 15 cents on the dollar, about perhaps the moral responsibility of reparations in America today?
Well, towards the end of the book, we do cover, some of the reparations movement and research. We spent time talking with the task force in Fulton County, down in Atlanta. Um, we don't take policy positions as journalists. However, there is a lot of data and history and facts and chronicling of people's current situations. And a lot of the same information is what people are talking about in communities across our country as they're debating reparations. We do make personal recommendations towards the end of our book. And two of them stick out that I should probably mention. The data that I cite from the Federal Reserve comes out every 3 years. It is not sliced from a geographic perspective. So I can't tell you, for example, if Black Americans in Kansas City, where I live, have less of a wealth gap with white Americans than those who live in maybe New York or New Jersey. The data is also not sliced by gender. So, we encourage people to think about, advocate for, talk to their local representation about transparency and also more wealth gap reporting and wealth data in our country. The other thing is that the other recommendation that we make is around working in partnership with someone who is different. And so Louise and I certainly did that in the reporting and writing of this book. She is a white American. She lives on the East Coast. Obviously, I am a Black American. I live in the middle of the country. She has 3 children and she's married. I was widowed in the pandemic and I don't have children. And so we had to really think about each other's situation and have a lot of deep conversations about how we would split up the work and how we would figure out, hours and budgeting and money and how we would handle those sort of things to create this book. And so we think if more Americans worked in partnership with someone who is different from them, that they would begin to truly understand the lived experiences of other people, and that would shape and impact the views that people have.
Brings out our better angels. I just was at the Braver Angels conference, which bringing together people of different political opinions in a civil way. So I think your partnership with Louise Story perhaps reflects that. What about the politics of all this, Ebony? I'm guessing you're no great fan of Donald Trump, but in the summer of 2024, both parties are claiming to address this. Trump has boasted about being more popular within the African-American community, particularly amongst African-American men, than previous Republican candidates. That's debatable. But how closely, for people who care about the issues that you're writing about, how closely should they be watching this election?
I think they should be watching it really closely. And I think a really good question for political and economic journalists to put to, the candidates are, what are their plans around the Black white wealth gap? Our book, like I said, doesn't take a political stance, but I think that people who care about these issues will be looking to hear, what are the plans at a very deep and concrete level.
What about the responsibility, Ebony, of wealthy African Americans? Fortunately, we don't have white mobs now burning down the wealthier districts of Atlanta or New York or other places where there are an increasingly large upper middle class African American community. Do you think, maybe not as an upper middle class wealthy African American, but certainly a voice of the African American community, do you think that, and you follow young Render and Glover, all wealthy, distinguished African Americans, do you think successful African Americans have a particular responsibility to address this?
Well, our book has a chapter named The Two Atlantas. And in that chapter, we explore the complexity around the Black white wealth gap within the Black community. So there is a Black gap where you have Black Americans who are wealthier, who are, have higher incomes, wealth they've passed on in their families. And then you have, those who haven't had that experience. And, that's also one of the issues that, Greenwood, the banking effort that we talked about earlier, faced, because some of its customers, a large percentage of its customer base, were people who had higher incomes. And so then, all sorts of questions began to arise, and they began to debate and have questions from their customers about, what does it mean to close the Black white wealth gap? And so certainly it can be closed by putting a focus on those at the upper level and creating more Black, millionaires, or things and efforts can be created, initiatives to focus on the entire distribution. And so that is a very real debate.
Ebony, I know you co-teach a class at Yale with Louise Story on some of these issues. You're also involved with the Marshall Project, a news nonprofit initiative. How important, in your view, is the role of both media and education on all this, particularly given the fact that affirmative action programs now are under fairly overt assault?
Well, education and journalism is extremely important. That's how one of the ways people get information, is through the media and through, books and through social media. And so, that's part of the reason that we wrote this book, is that we want to get, the information out to people. So there's a very significant role for media and for education in helping people understand this statistic.
But what about affirmative action? This is under assault. If it is indeed done away with, as it seems to be in the process of being done away with, would this only compound inequalities? Might somebody in the future write a book called 10 cents or 5 cents on the dollar without affirmative action programs?
I mean, it's certainly possible. We don't know what the future will hold. What I will say is that the people who are wanting certain initiatives to disappear and no longer be a part of, efforts, a good question is what would they like to replace it with? And I haven't heard a lot of, proposals around, what should replace some of the initiatives that are going away.
Well, Ebony Reed, the co-author with Louise Story of 15 Cents on the Dollar, How Americans Made the Black-White Wealth Gap. Important book, certainly a very, very important subject for Americans of every skin color. Congratulations on the book. It's already a bestseller, and we'll have to get you and perhaps Louise on the show to talk about these complicated subjects later in the year, perhaps during the election. Thank you so much, Ebony Reed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.